Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll jump into the action at Crete in 1941. From the air versus naval battle to the shock of the German airborne assault and the missed opportunities of the Allied defense. Hi Jesse, here we are again. Another week, another podcast. So it is Crete Part 2. We've looked at the campaign in the Balkans in 1941. We then decided, well, you can't talk about the Balkans without talking about Crete, this very, very famous episode of World War II. Mainly famous, of course, because of the involvement of the German Fallschirmjäger, the paratroops. We set the scene in the previous episode, talked about the strategic context, explored a little bit the concept of airborne troops, in particular, again, the German Fallschirmjäger, which is German for paratroopers. And I think we prepared the ground, haven't we, to really basically drill in and analyze and explore the actions, as I just said, in the air, on water, and on the ground, on Crete as well, and see what happens and to see which side. Probably, listeners, you already know this already. Which side comes up victorious? Exactly. I'm not going to give too much away, but I'll leave this now. Again, my usual question, where do we want to start? Where do we take it to?
I think we'll jump almost right into the action here, but just as a very brief reminder for listeners and viewers who might not have watched or heard the previous episode, Crete's important strategically in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Germans want to seize it after they throw the Brits out of mainland Greece in spring 1941. They decide to go for an primarily airborne assault with this new airborne paratrooper wing of their military. The Brits are trying to defend the long northern coast of the island at different points. They don't have a lot of mobility. They don't have a lot of ability to communicate quickly by radio with their forces. So it's a bit static what the Brits can do, but they do have 40,000 men. The Germans, on the other hand, have the advantage of air superiority. They can put those paratroopers where they want, when they want, and the Brits will have to react to that. The problem is the Germans vastly underestimate the amount of British and Greek, should be said, can't forget them, and Greek troops on the island. And of course, the paratroopers are very vulnerable when they first land because they don't have a lot of heavy weapons. And due to particularities of the German paratrooper setup, the weapons they do have are dropped in separate canisters. So man and parachute drops over here, canister with his weapons drops over here, and you better hope that they drop very close to each other and not that close to the enemy. So, key to this whole thing is control of the airfields. We're going to be basically talking about fighting over the airfields for most of this episode. There are three significant ones: Maleme, Heraklion, and Rethymnon. And Maleme is the most important one. That's going to be the big kind of focal point. If the Brits can keep it, the Germans will have a very hard time reinforcing their paratroopers before they get wiped out. If the Germans can take it, the Brits essentially cannot really defend the rest of the island because the Germans can fly in reinforcements that the Brits cannot match because they don't have an air force around here, which is a big problem in modern warfare. That, I hope, is the elevator pitch to set the stage for the German invasion of Crete. Matthias, I guess, pull your parachute strings and let's go for it.
and jump in there. Okay.
Indeed.
You already said it, and we talked about it in more detail in the last episode as well. Again, that Maleme is the most important airfield. It's the biggest one, the one that can use best. The terrain is most suitable for further landing. So the first fighting really is all about this. We talked a little bit about the German planned compromise solution So you just drop everything and everyone you've got on and around Maleme. Great idea, most important airfield. Yes, okay. But the problem you find then is you lose the element of surprise because you'd have consecutive waves. Do you spread guys out all over the island? Also an interesting idea because that gives you the element of surprise. You max on that particular point. However, on the other hand, the forces then coming down onto the ground might be too weak and might not have enough oomph behind them to basically achieve what they need to achieve. So compromise solution, which means the first wave of German paratroopers is dropped in the area of Maleme, and then in the afternoon you have then landings at the other two airfields. So let's start with the first airfield first. So it's the 20th of May, 1941, and at around 8 o'clock in the morning, the Germans arrive over Crete, and you've got the paratroopers jumping out of these Ju-52s. They land around mainly the airfield. Some of them actually land in the town of Chania itself. And the entire area there is defended by three Allied battalions. They've got 21, 22nd, and 23rd New Zealand Battalion. So that's, if you just look at the force composition here, that it's not looking all that good and well for the Germans, because the Germans, in theory, are dropping more or less one regiment in this area, which is basically three battalions, but they're attacking, the others are defending. So, in theory, it shouldn't look particularly good and well for the Germans, considering the New Zealanders also had time to dig in, prepare defensive positions. We talked about the difficulties and problems that the New Zealanders and other Allied contingents were facing, but that's we already talked about this. So the Germans drop into this area and they suffer horrendous casualties. So this is not going well. The first wave, when the reports come back, everyone goes, whoops, that's not what we expected at all. We thought they would all be a bit easier. Just to give you a few numbers. So one of the battalions, that's 3 Battalion, one of its companies loses 112 out of 126 men. That is a lot, and that is relatively rapidly. So it's the first wave that goes in, and very, very shortly they're all kind of gone, taken out of action. And when you look at the 3rd Battalion that lands there, you have, so it's a 600-man battalion, and 400 of these are killed on the first day. So there is quite an awful situation for the Germans. It looks as if the New Zealanders are controlling the situation to begin with. But then something happens, and so the Germans are pushing in more troops, and they're sending in more troops via transport planes, so they're jumping out. They're also beginning to bring in the gliders now. We talked about the gliders, and they're supposed to be landing on or close to the airfield, which they think at this stage the Germans should have seized already. Of course, they haven't, and a number of these gliders are destroyed by artillery fire or grenade launchers or something like this. So it's complete bloodbath. Some of these guys actually don't even make it. One of the German commanders of one of these detachments goes up in the air in a glider. The glider makes a funny turn and basically comes down, and he is killed. So it's a very interesting one, because 2 of the 3 commanders of these different spots where they land, one is killed, the other one is very heavily wounded. So you can see that there's complete carnage, and command and control should have gone completely out the window, pear-shaped, but because, and we talked about this again in the last episode very briefly, they're using the idea of mission command so other people can take over. So they really embodied this at that stage. Otherwise, the operation probably would have been over at this stage. But the Germans are able to bring in more troops, and the New Zealanders are not able to stop that. So they need to engage in the end. Yes, they destroy some of these gliders, but they need to start engaging these paratroopers once they've landed. And of course, the paratroopers are very, very well trained in fighting on the ground as well. Infantry fight, light infantry. So to cut a long story short, in this area, after a while, so you're now looking at around midday, the early afternoon, they're beginning to push the New Zealanders back, and the tide is turning slowly in this particular area, and it all boils down to a particular hill that you find in this area, and that is Hill 107. And Hill 107 overlooks the airfield, so it's very obvious that this is the commanding position. This is the vital ground. If you hold this, you control the airfield, and the New Zealanders hold this, and they're there, but as we go through the afternoon, as we go through the fighting there, the Germans eventually are able to push the New Zealanders off that particular hill. There is then the attempt during the night to launch a counterattack. That is an interesting one as well, particularly when you look at the whole thing of, as I already said, mission command and initiative. The idea is that the Allies want to launch a counterattack at night as quickly as possible while the Germans have not consolidated their positions. However, due to general confusion, due to problems with command and control, it actually takes all the way to the next morning for this attack to come in. Which then means the moment it is launched, first of all, the Germans have now been able to establish their defensive positions. And of course, they're now able to bring in air support as well, which they couldn't have done during the night. But that basically stops this particular attack here. And from that moment onwards, it's then, I wouldn't say obvious that the Germans are going to win, but the tide is turning. And while this is all ongoing and happening, you then in the afternoon have the landings at the other two airfields, where you also have very heavy fighting and some very, very interesting actions. I'm going to throw this back to you because I'm not quite sure what I've forgotten talking about the early stages of Maleme, because it's such a big fighting. I mean, I've been there a number of times, standing on the ground on military staff rides. You can spend days just talking about this particular action. If you really go down into the detail, there is some really interesting stuff that happens there. So what have I forgotten? What do we need to talk about?
Well, as usual, Matthias, you have forgotten nothing, of course. But is there anything a German officer can't do? I might quote. But no, aside from mutual flattery, one of the things that I find interesting is how, an airborne attack, it's almost like an amphibious landing. It's kind of all or nothing. I mean, you're going to overwhelm the opponent or you are going to be wiped out and there's no going back. And the German assault initially kind of, it's on that knife edge and it seems like it's going in the getting wiped out direction, because if you imagine this situation, if you're the New Zealanders for a moment, now, of course, you don't have all the equipment you want. You don't have all the air support you want. You don't have enough heavy weapons. But you can be prepared, and the other guy is floating down in his parachute with a pistol, and all of his other weapons are floating down somewhere else in these canisters. And you can do a lot of damage to an enemy that's in that vulnerable situation. Of course, even with the best case scenario for the Germans, it's going to take you time to organize once all of your guys land. Few of them break their ankles. Few of them are lost in the wrong place. You lose one of your canisters until you find that, etc., etc. So there's always going to be this period of extreme vulnerability even before the paratroopers can be organized, and then there's still a lightly armed force. And that's one of the reasons why we have these unbelievable killed in action statistics that you mentioned, is because of that. And I find it interesting that there's one group farther west of Maleme that doesn't get wiped out, and that's the one that becomes, it's like when there's a crack in concrete, it gets a little water in it and then it freezes. This is very Canadian because we always have lots of problems in the winter. When water gets in places, it freezes and then it just splits. It makes that crack bigger and bigger. And that little German group of paratroopers that survive the initial slaughter of them, essentially, that becomes the kernel that gets reinforced, that can protect a little zone behind it where they can drop more paratroopers who can organize in safety, and then they end up taking this crucial Hill 107 from the New Zealanders. Now, there's a bit of a colossal command and control failure here, because the New Zealanders launch a pretty fierce counterattack against the Germans. They do a lot of damage, but they end up withdrawing from the hill when they could have defended it for longer. And the commander of the battalion that was controlling the hill thought that he was losing. Even though in hindsight, we probably wouldn't come to that conclusion when we're looking at the early engagements around there. But That's what it seemed like to him. So he did the cautious, conservative thing. Well, I'm losing here. I'm about to be overwhelmed. I'm going to pull back a bit more and continue the fight. It seems understandable at the time, but of course, we have a much more comprehensive view, and that was a fatal mistake. It was the fatal mistake of the entire campaign because of how important Maleme was. Often, it makes no sense to sacrifice your whole unit by fighting till the bitter end. It makes sense to husband your forces, to preserve your forces, to move back and fight. But this is an all or nothing situation. It's one of those exceptional situations. And so that New Zealand battalion, the better decision would have been to fight to the bitter end, even if they thought they were about to be wiped out. So that I find is kind of an interesting scenario. It's representative of these communications problems and command and control problems that the Allied troops have. It's not just the New Zealanders by any stretch of the imagination. And it leads to this absolutely crucial error, essentially, of withdrawing too quickly from that crucial hill 107. So you already have in the first 36 hours this crucial mistake that might not in the moment have seemed so crucial, but turns out to have been. And I think that's one of the things I think of when I think of Maleme, that sort of knife edge, and looking at it from the perspective on the ground kind of makes sense. But then the bigger perspective, which the overall Allied commander, Freyberg, is supposed to have. So he's supposed to be able to then radio to that battalion commander, no, I don't think you're being overwhelmed. And even if you are, stay put, because it's crucial to the overall operational success. Tactically, it might be not what you would want to do, but operationally, we have to do it to save the island. That radio conversation or that communication never happened, right? And yeah, that says a lot about how mistakes get made and battles get lost, I think.
I think absolutely right. When you look at the performance, or the individual performance of, in this case, the New Zealanders and the people fighting here on the top of the hill, that is now the 22nd Battalion. I mean, they are fighting bravely and valiantly and what have you, but it is the higher echelons where you have the big issue, and that is command and control. It's also interesting, but I always wonder about this. So you look at the battalion commander. That's a chap called Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew. You might say, well, maybe he just wasn't up for the fight. Maybe it was a bit, forgive the word, for argument's sake, well, he was a coward or whatever. He didn't want to fight. Well, far from it. So he had been awarded the Victoria Cross in the First World War. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, at the age of 20. So he was the youngest at that stage New Zealand recipient of the Victoria Cross. So for quite heroic offensive action on the Western Front towards the end of the First World War. So he most definitely was not a coward, but something went wrong here. And the question really is, what went wrong? And I think one of the things that you can see being played out on the Allied side here, a number of times, not only him, but perhaps here or another time we go into a bit more detail when we talk about Freyberg as well. It is the interesting thing that quite often it seems that people who are particularly good at a certain level. So, for example, if you stick with Leslie Andrew here, very, very brave, very, very enthusiastic, very good at the lower tactical level. Well, that's what he wins the VC for the action there at the end of the First World War. Might not have been able to see the bigger, as you already said, it's not even operational, bigger tactical, maybe also operational, perhaps strategic, if you want to bring it all the way up, picture here, and the importance of that particular hill, because otherwise this is the time where you stand and fight, and that means you get overrun. That's simple as that. You don't withdraw from a position like this when you understand, or if you should say, that this is absolutely vital ground. The moment you seize this terrain, the Germans are able to bring in more reinforcements, are able to win this fight. So if you stand and fight, if that means your battalion gets wiped out, but it also means that you, in the end, you now as the Allied forces are going to win the fight. This is what you do. So there are a number of shortcomings in the command and control system approaches and the handling of situations in the Allied camp, which again we can go into much more detail later on, which you might say probably lose them this particular battle. Because it is still a bit mind-boggling when you look at the forces. We talked about the forces. And yes, you can say, well, the Allies were disorganized and they didn't have a lot of equipment. But just look at the sheer force ratios, look at the time they had to prepare. The fact that they lost Crete, to me, is still completely mind-boggling. That should never have happened. This is the battle that the Allies, on paper, can't lose. Despite air and all these things, but they did. And I think these are the crucial bits. This is the interesting bit. As I said, when you go there and you stand on Crete and you talk about this from a military point of view, quite often the discussions focus on these things. So what does that say about command and control? What does that say about motivating your soldiers to fight? What does that mean, being there and fighting and defending the vital ground? Well, if it comes to the worst, it means you stand and die, because that's the important thing, as awful as that sounds, but that's what you need to do. And here there are a number of failures, and you already talked about this. You've got the German troops that are there, more or less splitting the New Zealand force, and there's all sorts of confusion, and the New Zealanders think that they've been overrun. They ask for reinforcements. They don't get them because the brigade commander thinks that the other battalion is engaged fighting the German paratroopers, which that battalion wasn't. So you can see all sorts of really confusing issues on the ground. And maybe one of the main problems I always say is, when you look at it through the Allied perspective, is this lack of mission command, which the Germans do close to perfection, you might say, whatever perfection is, but very, very well on the ground in and on Crete, and the British don't. I think it's one of the shortcomings of the British Army through most of the Second World War, that even though on paper there is something like mission command, in reality they don't do it. There are exceptions. Again, for example, the paratroopers doing extremely well, because you need to be able to do this because you're on your own and what have you. But the standard British Army, that I now include New Zealanders, Australians, because they've got the same, you might say, structure, the same doctrine. They don't really have this approach. It's a very, very different approach. And I think that is really what gives the Germans the upper hand here. And which, again, and then I'll shut up, which makes this particular episode so interesting to analyze from a modern military perspective, as well as having been there a number of times. This is what the discussion tends to focus on. Because all modern armies, Western armies, they do some sort of mission command. And I think, well, we would have done this very, very differently based on the principles that we're using now, which, let's face it, to a large degree, are based on German principles of the Second World War. It's quite interesting as well. So,
I think
I've rambled on for quite enough.
There's, part of the discussion is about Freiberg himself, the New Zealand overall ground commander on Crete. If we have time at the end of the episode, maybe in the war room, where we have exclusive non-public content, we might talk a bit more about Freiberg, but suffice to say, there's a debate about his performance as well. He's interesting because he's also extremely decorated from the First World War. He won a Victoria Cross. He won a couple of Distinguished Service Orders. He was mentioned in dispatches more than once. He was wounded numerous times. I think I read he was wounded 9 times in the First World War. So this guy is not afraid of combat by any stretch of the imagination. And one of the, because it's funny, we talk about mission command where, paratroopers are able to continue somehow functioning as a group, even when half of their force has been killed in action or more or what have you. Well, one of the issues is you have Freiberg not able to effectively communicate with his subordinates, so his subordinates have to make decisions, and they end up making some bad ones. So it's kind of like, because of the communications problems, the British and British-led British Empire troops are forced into a mission command situation, but then the decisions are the wrong ones in some cases. So it's kind of a bit of a cascade effect, but we'll leave, I think, much of the debate about Freiberg personally till either the end of this episode or the war room, depending on how the time plays out. I wanted to say a few words about the other main airstrips and the fighting for them. They are not as strategically important, but still there's some fairly fierce fighting going on there around Heraklion. The Germans at one point in the first few days, they capture half the town. But then I'm pretty sure it's Australian troops absolutely throw them right out and retake control of Heraklion. So you'd think, things, if you're a British Empire soldier in Heraklion, you think things are going not bad, right? Because you've just kicked those guys out and they're not threatening your position. A little bit similar, although a bit more touch and go, at the other airfield at Rethymnon, the German paratroopers are able to capture a little bit of high ground overlooking or close to the airfield, just south of it. So you kind of have a bit of a similar situation to this Hill 107 at Maleme, where the Germans get in control of it. But in this case, the Allies are able to throw them off of those hills. It takes a couple days, but they throw them off. So here again, you're kind of holding your own as the British, and that's all you have to do. You just have to keep holding. And if the Germans can't take those airfields, eventually they're going to lose. So I find it's interesting that, you can win all the less important battles. And if you lose the important one, the whole thing is going to unravel. Which reminds me, something I wanted to mention earlier on this topic of what the Germans expected versus what they got. The Greeks don't welcome them. This is the opposite happens. So you have these 10,000 Greek troops, they fight. They fight sometimes under British or New Zealand command, and they fight as well as they can. And you have some civilians who had a tradition of guerrilla warfare against the Turks in earlier times, who take up arms as well against the Germans. And they're going to pay a price for that. We'll talk about that a little bit later, how the Germans respond. But not only do they not welcome you, they're not neutral either. Some of them are taking up arms and killing your paratroopers as they land in their fields or olive gardens or whatever. So olive orchards. So you have things that could be, that are just going the Allies' way, with this one big exception. Even if you permit me to keep ranting here for one more minute, Matthias, even at sea, things are mixed. The Allies do have some success. So you have these 4 different Royal Navy forces trying to prevent these seaborne landings coming in. And they actually see a couple of these flotillas off. They sink a bunch of ships on one of them. Then they force one that was led by or protected by an Italian destroyer, the Sagittario, which then heroically, I think we have to give the crew of the Sagittario their due. We talk a lot about Italian difficulties and that their navy wasn't capable of, leading an amphibious operation. But the crew of the Sagittario took serious risks, lays a big smoke screen, and is able to get their convoy to turn around and go back to Greece. But you have some Royal Navy success. The problem comes when the German Air Force arrives, and they inflict horrific losses on the Royal Navy. They sink a couple of cruisers, they damage a couple of battleships, they sink several smaller warships. The cruiser HMS Gloucester goes down with 700 hands. So Lord Mountbatten, who will later become infamous for overseeing the Dieppe raid in 1942, his ship is sunk and he has to be fished out of the sea. So you do have some British success at sea, preventing the situation from getting worse, giving their ground troops a chance to defeat the paratroopers. And then air power happens. And that's why, to me, Crete is not just about Airborne and all the Airborne were an elite and they managed to do this and that. Yes. But that air versus sea power theme from the first few years of World War II, I mean, this is one of those episodes. Like, this is the reason why nobody's going to do much without aircraft carriers and organizing naval task forces around aircraft carriers in the second half of the war, because you have these kind of awful naval losses. The Warspite is damaged. It's a battleship, all this kind of stuff. A bunch of them are almost out of ammunition. They got to run back to Alexandria, so they're not there. So the Royal Navy gives up the seas north of Crete, and that is another death knell for Freiberg's poor ground forces on the island.
Very, very true. I mean, this is a proper tri-service action, you might want to call it. And we've said a number of times, particularly in the Axis camp, where the Navy doesn't really play a role. You have the Royal Navy in the other camp, you already mentioned that, and that must not be overlooked. And the importance of that also to the British or the Allied war plan, this knowledge that you control the sea. What does that mean? It makes it much more difficult for the enemy to support the troops on Crete, to land more troops on Crete. Perhaps they weren't expecting the airdrops to be in the end successful. We already talked about some of the issues as to why they were successful and the reason for that. But I mean, that already does play a role. And in many ways, if you say, well, you could argue that for Crete, from a naval perspective, is really crippling for the Royal Navy. The losses that they sustain here are really, really heavy. And it's also interesting because you mentioned the Italian side. We tend to not to mention the Italians. I said, I think in the previous episode, very briefly, well, the Italians do not really play a role in the German planning. So they're kind of there, but no one cares about them. So whatever they do, there's a small contingent that lands, so an army contingent lands on the east coast of Crete when the fighting is basically over. So they're coming from the Dodecanese Islands, which had at that stage been Italian territory for quite some time. But of course, the Italian Navy, we talked about the Navy as one of the issues and the problems that the Navy is facing, the Italian one. Well, you just gave an example of a very, or you might say, gallant action by the Italian Navy. And there's another one, for example, a similar scenario to what you've just said. So on the night of the 21st, 22nd of May, so in the Maleme area, you now have the situation that the other two landings or the other two drops that you talked about, they're not going particularly well for the Germans. And as you say, well, if you're fighting in Heraklion, well, you might actually say as an allied side, we know what, we're winning this. This is looking pretty good. This is looking pretty decent. So we fixed the enemy here. They can't move. So that looks all right. Of course, what has happened now, as we already explained, is that in Maleme, the Germans are beginning to get the upper hand, pushing the enemy troops off Hill 107, all these issues that we mentioned. The Germans looking at this, particularly Student, the German general, looks at this and says, okay, we need to reinforce success. And we're going to send everything that we still have into Maleme airfield. And so this is exactly what they do. So they start landing the mountain troops with planes, but they also say in this area, we can land more troops if we send in one of these convoys. And that means we can establish a proper bridgehead, and that should all go to Maleme as well. And I think we mentioned it before, when you talk of convoy, well, you shouldn't think of 1944 D-Day, a huge big armada. So basically what it is they go into the Greek fishing ports and look at boats and barges and whatever is available and say, yeah, can we have that, please? Take it away. Put troops on that and set it off to send them all to Crete. So that's basically what it looks like. So it's a poor man's armada, you might say. And this particular one, which goes towards Maleme, it consists of 20 of these barges, kaikes they're called, if that's the right pronunciation. And that's basically what it is. And they're protected by one Italian torpedo boat, and that's Lupo, so the Wolf. And the commandant of that is Captain Francesco Mimbelli. Becomes quite famous afterwards because he then continues to fight in the war in the Black Sea, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And this force, as they're going towards the Crete mainland, towards Maleme, they are intercepted by force, I think I always get that right, force D it is. And that is 3 light cruisers and 4 destroyers. And so what do you do? And similar to what you just mentioned, so basically this torpedo boat tries to engage the British fleet in order to make it possible for the other boats to get away. It doesn't really work. Quite a few are sunk, so there are a number of casualties. Quite a few actually are on the German side. I think in the end something like 300. I think if I'm not mistaken, just under 300 German guys die, plus a few Italians on the Lupo. But still about 2,000 of the Germans managed to get away. So they turned the boats around and get away. So if this guy hadn't been there, it would have been a completely different story. So you've got another heroic action by the Italian Navy. So well done, the Italian Navy here. And what you also find is 1 or 2 episodes where the British naval contingent is afterwards criticized by the Naval High Command There's one episode where one of these forces is about to engage one of the these funny convoys that are, as I said, the poor men's armada, are making their way towards Crete. But then they turn around because they say we don't have enough anti-aircraft ammunition anymore on the ships here, and we know what's going to happen the moment we start engaging this convoy, for a better term. We're going to get hit by the air. So they say no, we're not doing that. They withdraw. And then they get hit as they've withdrawn. And later on, the after-action report of the Admiralty basically concludes that was exactly the wrong decision. What they should have done was get in and amongst this convoy, because that would have prevented the Germans from using their air power to good effect, because they would have feared that they were dropping bombs onto their own troops. So again, benefit of hindsight is a wonderful thing, and it's easy to criticize actions when you're sitting in a nice office in Admiralty Arch in central London in 1941 or 1942. But you get the idea. So again, it's this fog of war, it's this general confusion that you have. It shows you a lot about, as we already said, the different services. So what's superior? It's a little bit, to a degree, what you see in the Pacific War, at the later stage of the war, much bigger. So the importance of air, much more important than battleships or what have you. So you're beginning to see the same thing here. So, so even though it's looking still relatively good in some areas for the Allies, the fact they've now got this Maleme peace, which the Germans are now holding, despite the fact that the naval transport, the naval convoys are turned back, quite a few of these barges are sunk, the Germans are now getting the upper hand on the 21st, you might say 21st of May. So it's beginning to look difficult for the Allies.
No question about that. I mean, the British would learn a couple of other very bitter lessons about the effectiveness of air power against sea power when they, because you mentioned the Pacific theater, it made me think of when they sent battleships in late 1941, when the war with Japan begins. They send the Prince of Wales, I think it is, and then they're just immediately sunk, essentially. So, right. So on Crete, within the first couple of days, you have this critical situation that develops. The Royal Navy is forced basically to withdraw mostly, and you have the loss of the most important airfield. Most of the island is still in British and Greek hands, but they're not in a position now to kind of turn the tide, if you will. The New Zealanders try a counterattack to retake the airfield, but by now you have these mountain troops that have arrived. They're fresh, they're rested, they're well-trained, they're well-equipped, and they're more numerous. So slowly you have the Germans in that critical area, not on the island as a whole, but in that critical area, they now also have a numerical advantage. And they can bring in better equipment as well. So now they have a numerical and a firepower advantage and air superiority. And the outcome of a battle where one side has that and the other doesn't is, I mean, it's never say never. There are always exceptions in history, but it's then very, very likely that the side that has those three advantages is going to be able to carry the day. And that's essentially the situation that the Brits and Greeks are facing. There's another, I guess, in New Zealand, probably more famous than in the rest of the world, counterattack against a hill near Hanya called Pink Hill, where the Maori battalion charges the hill and captures it and all the rest, but it's not the airfield, right? And that's what's important. So the writing starts to be on the wall here within a couple of days. Not everything is lost yet, but it's going in that direction. The Greek king evacuates the island on the 24th of May. That's not a great sign when your king decides, I'd better leave before things get worse. And the Brits then decide to start moving towards the south coast and evacuating from there, although there's an evacuation from Heraklion itself on the north coast as well. But this main grouping near Maleme, they're going to have to get to the south coast at a small place called Sfakia, I think it's called. So they've got to go the whole width of the island. That's going to be a little tricky. Of course, they're being chased the whole way. You have all sorts of desperate rearguard actions as they go through this gorge, through the mountains towards the south coast. I walked part of it myself, not under threat of being captured by the Germans, of course. But it was quite an impressive thing to imagine this defeated, still cohesive, but exhausted and defeated force going for another British evacuation after Dunkirk, after mainland Greece. Now there's a Crete evacuation that's happening as well. And of course, the British and Australians and Greeks at Heraklion must have felt pretty bitter about it because they just whooped the Germans. They just threw them right out. And now all of a sudden you're told, you're out of here. We've lost the bigger battle, and you need to be evacuated. So there's all sorts of interesting smaller actions on these retreats towards the south coast. The British land a commando unit to cover the retreat, and they rush up to the north to be able to cover the retreat of the larger body of troops. And they end up making a super dramatic last stand. Along with some New Zealanders and some Maoris, they get surrounded by the Germans, and they basically fight to the last, what's the word I'm looking for? Le dernier patron. In French, there's a famous painting, the last bullet to the last cartridge. So they basically fight to the last cartridge, and like 600 of 800 of these commandos, British commandos, are killed, right? So we're looking at, in a way, comparable numbers to the German paratroopers on the first day. So that's kind of how things start to unravel after the New Zealanders are not able to retake Maleme airfield. I mean, there's lots more that you can throw in there, Matthias, if you want to flesh out the picture. But yeah, that's where it's going.
This is exactly where it's going. And the interesting thing is that the New Zealanders are now beginning to realize, well, before they start all the withdrawal, they're beginning to realize the importance of Maleme. And that's why they try to launch, and in the end, they do launch this counterattack, or these counterattacks actually that come in. But they all peter out because they simply do not assemble a strong enough force to push the Germans off the height and from the away from the area of the airfield. So you can see they realize the importance of, but now it's too late. So they've missed their chance. And what is really interesting when you look at this, and everyone now, with the benefit of hindsight and just very broad brush, everyone says, well, once Maleme is taken, well, it's over, and while the Brits and the Allies are on the run, and that's a very, very easy thing for the Germans. Well, far from it. Because now a number of times, and you in particular, we've talked about the other areas where they're fighting, where it gets very nasty, where German troops are still being cut off. I mean, there is a relatively famous picture, German aerial reconnaissance picture, where a German unit took basically rocks and roads with these rocks that are put into the sand on the beach. Wrote this message, well, here's particular unit, sent ammunition and food, we're cut off. We're not going to survive. It's quite an interesting and famous picture. That was, so aerial reconnaissance took it, and then they dropped some resupplies. But you can see the desperation there. So the Germans are also, you might say both sides are on the back foot, so to speak. And then I would say it then basically boils down to determination and the will to succeed. And there is an interesting meeting on the 26th of May. So when we think, well, the fighting is over and, the Germans have won and everything is just now an after show, it's a bit of mopping up. No, far from it. So you have a meeting in Athens where all the senior German Air Force commanders, because, again, it's an Air Force operation mainly. We've mentioned a number of times that the paratroopers belong to the Air Force. So you've got Richthofen, Jeschonnek, and Löhr. So these are three very senior Air Force generals. They discussed the situation there. And there was a liaison officer that I think Richthofen had sent to Crete to get an idea about what's going on, then come back and report back. And that is interesting. So I think it's 27th, I think, 27th of May. So the quote that is given is, so the meeting on the 27th, the guy comes back on the 26th, and he says, summing up the situation, he says that the paratroopers are in a poor condition, they're at loose ends, and he said there's an absolute immediate need for reinforcements by sea, and particularly of heavy weaponry, if the operation is supposed to succeed. So you can see the Germans are thinking this is not going particularly well. So if the Allies make a stand and really fight hard and prevent any reinforcements coming in via the sea, this operation is not going to succeed. So, but now it boils down to, for a better term, let's call it the battle of the will. And maybe this is where the Germans at that particular stage have the upper hand. You already mentioned it. So if you're in the British camp, up to this point, the entire war has been defeat after defeat after defeat. Your morale is not going to be particularly high. Do you really want to stand and fight and die in Crete? Is that going to change things? Or do you think it's just going to be, in inverted commas, just another retreat like all the other ones? And the German case, completely different. I think it was in the last episode where I said that they stand 5 feet tall. Well, that of course complete nonsense. So at least 10 feet tall, because they've won everything that is to win. So they have this feeling, the feeling of superiority at the moment. And maybe that is one of the contributing factor. I mean, I think it was Napoleon who said morale is to the material as 3-1 in war, and the Germans obviously have the morale here. And I would argue let's call them the British for a better phrase, because we know that New Zealanders and other troops involved here, but keep it simple. They don't have it. But even this force that is there, well, they have just been kicked out of the Greek mainland. So that's an army on the retreat. That already is, you might argue, is a beaten army. And that is probably, I would say, is the big problem that they're facing. It's more the factor of morale that they don't have than anything else. And really, when you start comparing that to the German assessment at that particular time, and I also say, things are not going well. This is awful. We need more reinforcements. We need this. We need that. Otherwise, we might not win this. But I would argue that's my conclusion. There might be different reasons as well, but that's, to me, is the main point. It boils down to the will to succeed and the will to win.
Yes, I mean, morale is obviously very significant. Who am I to argue with Napoleon on that score? He also completely ignored logistics. The supply train will just follow us. He said, l'intendance suivra, right? The supplies out, they'll just follow us, right? And I think that's also a part. Wow, Napoleon is explaining Crete to us in 1941. It's interesting. I didn't expect this little this turn of events here. But I do think one of the issues is the mobility for the Brits, because even if you're struggling with some bits of morale, you do have lots of British units that fight hard. There are bayonet charges where they carry German positions against these elite paratroopers. So it's, morale is not completely in the tank. It's obviously somewhat of a problem, also higher up, because you're more cautious then, you're less decisive, that sort of thing. But if you don't have trucks, and you have now this critical situation near Maleme where you're outnumbered there, you've got to get people somewhere. And if you can't do that, or you don't give the orders to do that soon enough, maybe we can say that's morale because you're less decisive as well, then you're not going to be able to counter that threat, even if you have good morale. If you don't have trucks, it's hard to move people. And you don't have good command and control, it's also hard to move people or not move people or whatever you have to do. So, long story short, it's very interesting. I didn't know the details of this meeting in Athens that you mentioned before. I think it's quite interesting because if we look at the other side, by May 26th, 27th, I mean, they're already accepting defeat, the British. They're already ordering the evacuations. They're already sending in the commandos as a desperate rear guard under an officer by the name of Laycock, I think his name is. He ends up escaping the encirclement and surviving. But you have one side that's saying we've lost, and the other side saying, well, we might still lose. And that doesn't reflect super well on the Allied side, one has to admit. In any case, there is another evacuation that takes place. I think of the about 40,000 Greek and British troops, they get off something like 18 or 19,000 in total, which you might say, hey, under the circumstances, you're losing an operation, you don't have air superiority, and you get off almost half of your force. That's not bad. At the same time, you're still losing and you're still giving up half of your force, either killed and wounded or captured. You can't keep doing this and expect to have a result at the end of the war that you're going to be okay with. So they give up 12,000 British and Empire prisoners of war, which is a pretty serious pretty serious blow. These guys are professional. These guys are trained. They've been in the army for some time now, and they're gone, right? And you don't have them for your North African campaign. So all this happens, by the way, just we have a little chronological perspective here. All of this happens until June 1st. That's when basically it's over, essentially. So you have May 20th to June 1st, not quite 2 weeks, for the Germans to defeat and then chase away the Allied force. And when we look back in hindsight, that Hill 107 falls on the second day, right? So it really goes to show there are these, at the operational level, there are these turning points. I know previously on this podcast, we've talked about, well, if you look at a big war like World War II, can you really say there's a turning point? Is that how we can best understand history and how change happens in history? Or is it something more gradual and systematic and structural? Well, here, I would say the lower we go from strategy to operations, the more grand strategy to operations to tactics, let's say, the more the turning point idea, I think, has, you can see it more.
So we looked at the numbers. You look in total, roughly speaking, 22,000 German troops being involved, and we broke this down. So the paratroopers plus mainly these mountain troops. So in total on the German side, you're looking at roughly speaking, 2,500 casualties. You've got quite a number of missing. There are probably people who went down in the sea, so that's another 2,000. So if you add all this up, that's also some air crew that go down. You're looking at, what is that, 2,000, 4,500, roughly speaking, out of a force of, roughly speaking, 22,000. So that's heavy casualties. Particularly when you then think who's sustaining these casualties. So it's mainly these troops that land in the first wave. So I gave you some numbers. Say when you look at the first wave, for example, that lands at Maleme, the casualties stand at somewhere in the region of 80 to 90%. So absolutely atrocious what you find there. Of course, all of them are dead, a lot are wounded. Some of them, because this is the way this type of warfare works, they might just end up in a ditch with a broken ankle as well. But a lot of people die as well. The fighting is, as we now said a number of times, is quite nasty, is quite brutal. We actually had, he wasn't officially a family member, but about to become a family member, who was killed on Crete. So he was my great uncle's fiancé, and we still have the engagement pictures. So that's in the summer of the spring of 1941. And 2 weeks later, he was then killed on Crete. The story goes, I don't know if that is true or not, but that's the family story, that he jumped out of the plane, landed in a tree, and while he was trying to cut himself loose with the knife, he was shot by a British soldier who came along and did that. So which, of course, if that really happened, would be a war crime. But that's another discussion for another day.
That's what happened to the commanding officer of the Canadian parachute battalion in 1945. He got stuck in a tree and got taken out by a German. Yeah. So it's a common story, common theme, probably. So these casualties are absolutely awful. I mean, you then on top of that you have another interesting impact. So, for example, when you look at the transport planes, so these Ju-52s, they lose quite a lot of these as well. In total, they're losing around 280 aircraft. So it's mainly these transport planes, but there are also some fighters, some dive bombers, and what have you. But that actually, if you fast forward, is quite interesting, has a crippling effect on the German logistical resupply system later on. So one of the reasons, I mean, there's a bit of a stretch, but one of the reasons why the resupply of the German troops in Stalingrad fails is because they simply do not have enough transport planes anymore to create this air bridge. So you can see there are long-term effects here as well. And what you also find on the Italian side, when you look at the naval component, you're looking at one destroyer that is damaged and torpedo boat, that's the Lupo that we mentioned earlier. They're also damaged. So very heavy casualties. And of course, that has a knock-on effect. And that is perhaps one of the most far-reaching consequences of this particular fight, is that Hitler looks at this and he says, okay, you know what, the days of the paratroopers are over.
the casualties were so horrendous. So this shock momentum has worn off. We've played our trump card. This is gone. It's nothing new anymore. Everyone will expecting paratroopers to be used somewhere. So let's not ever do that again. And this is the basically the only and the last time that German paratroopers are used en masse in their proper role, jumping out of airplanes. There are a number of smaller actions, also, for example, on the Eastern Front later on in 1941 and in June 1941, where they get used in their traditional role. But this is very small beer, so it's just seizing a bridge or something like this. But apart from that, they cease to be used in their original role as people jumping out of planes. They're still being considered to be an elite force. That's why they also fight, for example, on the Cassino, they fight in Normandy and in other areas. There is this nimbus, this aura around them of being an elite force. And this is to a large degree also linked to Crete. I mean, even in World War II, so after Crete, they had on their left cuff, they had a band which basically just said Crete. And the order of the day was that everybody who wore a uniform which had on the cuff the Crete band had to be saluted by every other officer, including superior officers all the way up to general. That is unusual for the German army at that particular time. But that is something, again, to just show the importance that this had. And it's still, to a large degree, you might say, it is still one of the defining moments of World War II for the German paratroopers. So this plus the fighting at Cassino. I mean, officially it's no longer commemorated because there was what I would call a bit of a witch hunt a few years ago when it came to tradition of the German armed force. We talked about this in a different episode, so I don't need to repeat this. But it's still there. So the idea of the German paratrooper, the Fallschirmjäger at on Crete and particularly Cassino is still something that resonates. So that is still there. But that's, you might say, it's the legacy of it. The immediate legacy was very different. We're not going to use these guys in their role anymore. So very interesting end of that particular episode, you might say. And of course, on the Allied side, it's completely different. So I'm going to throw it over to you now, so to talk us through the Allied casualties and the consequences as well, because that's fascinating. Because lessons drawn are completely different.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the modern German armed forces are constantly faced with a dilemma. Such a big part of military culture and cohesion and tradition is about the past. And what do you do if you're Germany, right? And where do you draw that line? And obviously, it's not one that everyone agrees with in a lot of different cases. However, I have one quote from Hitler. Not often that we quote Hitler on the podcast, I would say, but on this topic of not using paratroopers again very much in the war, and certainly not on any scale comparable. When he's talking to Student, the airborne general, he just says it plain as day. We shall never do another airborne operation. Crete proved that the days of the parachute troops are over. The parachute arm is one that relies entirely on surprise. In the meantime, the surprise factor has exhausted itself. So, we rolled the dice, we took our chance, we did a paratrooper thing, and it's not repeatable in Hitler's view. Oh, one of those little factoid that I had on my list since the beginning of the last episode. Max Schmeling was one of those paratroopers that jumped out onto Crete. If listeners among you, there are any boxing fans, you might know the name Max Schmeling because he was, in the late 1930s, the heavyweight champion of the world. And here he was jumping on Crete. And he survived the battle, I should add. He was one of the quite lucky ones. But as usual, I digress. As far as Allied losses are concerned, there are something along the lines of 5,000 to 6,000 killed on the Allied side. 2,000 of them are sailors, mostly of the Royal Navy, and something like 500 Greeks. The rest are British Empire troops. But Obviously, for the individual level, every death is a tragedy. There's no question. 6,000 men is not going to make a big strategic difference. But the shipping losses, well, not shipping in terms of cargo ships, but the losses of warships for the Royal Navy, that's what can have a big impact, because in this 2-week period from 20th of May to 2nd of June, until the evacuation is completed, sunk, they lose 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and then some smaller vessels. But 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers in 1941 in the Mediterranean is a huge loss. In addition to that, damaged, which can take months to repair depending on how bad the damage is, 3 battleships, 1 aircraft carrier, 7 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. I mean, these are extremely heavy losses. Sure, some of the damaged ones won't take months, but still, you're losing a couple of dozen large warships in order to lose an island, right? So it's in vain, essentially, these Royal Navy losses. So very, very severe naval losses for the British at a time when they are unbelievably stretched in their attempt to stay alive and keep fighting and keep their island provisioned with enough food and enough supplies. So devastating naval losses. It makes me think a little bit, it's not quite as bad, but it makes me think a little bit of the German Navy's losses in the Norway operation, even though, of course, that operation was successful, but still. Right, I want to say a word about Greek losses in a bit more detail as well, because we've talked about how this is kind of more well-known in Germany because of the parachute aspect, more well-known in New Zealand because there was a New Zealand commander and lots of New Zealand troops, and it's controversial. What was the performance of the command? But it's famous in Greece as well. And one of the reasons it's famous in Greece is because of German atrocities that occur. We mentioned that some Greek civilians on Crete take up arms to attack their invaders. And as you mentioned, Matthias, I think in the previous episode, it's like codified for the German paratroopers that they're supposed to be merciless in the face of guerrillas, that they're essentially supposed to kill them. But of course, they take it a step further, as is always the case with trying to repress guerrillas. They end up executing a whole lot of Greek civilians on Crete. There are several quite infamous villages where larger massacres take place in May, June, and also a little bit later in the summer. I think they kill about 500 civilians in the aftermath of the battle. But the resistance on Crete is something that continues for the rest of the war. And in 1943, there's a whole spate of executions of civilians as well. The German occupation commander at the time, Müller is his name. He gets the nickname Butcher of Crete. He's executed after the war. So there's even a few Allied soldiers who joined the Greek resistance instead of giving up and becoming prisoners of war. So there's, in our world, Anglo-German world, if we're going to slice it that way, I think it makes sense. We don't know as much about this Greek story that continues on and on for years with more lives lost. So I wanted to mention that before we close out this episode, which is getting a little bit long in the tooth because we've been having so much fun. Matthias, is there anything you feel a burning need to add to our second Crete episode? And if so, let it rip.
But just very briefly, well, if I can do anything briefly, but again, absolutely. Again, just looking at the aftermath that you already talked about. I mean, you explained the reprisals, you explained the harsh treatment of the civilian population. I mean, that is an interesting and nasty factor that runs all the way through, basically all the way to 1945. You mentioned Müller, so the Butcher of Crete. So he's then sent away for a time, and then someone else takes over. That's a chap called Heinrich Kreipe. He's a major general. He's actually abducted by British commandos who land and basically abduct him, take him back, and he ends up in a prisoner of war camp. So that's an interesting kind of, let's call it spy story for a better term. Special forces story. That's really quite interesting. The people involved are also very interesting. So it's on the British side. The main guy is a Major Patrick Fairmore. So it's a fascinating little story that comes out of that one as well. Then there's another guy. It's a chap called Bruno Breuer. He is there. He takes over from Müller for a short period. Again, there are different accounts. Some accounts say that of all the commanders of that island, he was actually the most, what's the right word? Correct, likable, what have you. He'd actually been there on the landing. He was one of the commanders of one of these task groups landing with the Paris in 1941. And he's also then, after the war, tried and executed. And some people have said that so he was unfortunate because he was made to pay for crimes that other people committed. There's, again, you can see it's all getting very, very muddied water, very difficult, very nasty. Bottom line is that a lot of the Greek civilians get executed. You also have, of course, very briefly look at the structure of Crete and what do you do with Crete? I mean, you've seized this now. What do you do with it? So you're not really going to go and attack the Suez Canal. You're not going to attack anything from Crete. So it basically becomes Fortress Crete, and that means it's a defensive thing. So you just protect this. The numbers go up and down. So from, I think, the max is somewhere in the region of 70,000 soldiers stationed there, mainly Germans, also a few Italians. Goes down to somewhere in the region of 10,000 in the autumn of 1944. Then it remains there. And you have the administrative structure is basically about 80% of the island are controlled by the Germans. The Italians get the eastern part because that's where they landed in 1941. That's also close to the territories they have in the Aegeus anyway. Of course, the Germans then take over in 1943 after the surrender of Italy. What is then also interesting that towards the end of the war, you got some Allied forces landing. Then there's a bit, you might say, there's a bit of an unofficial truce, and the German forces still remain on the island. They don't surrender till the end of the war, and you basically got these two sides, including the Greek civilians, just staring at each other, but nothing really as nothing happens is the wrong word, but no big military action happens because both sides probably know that, well, whatever we do, it's completely pointless. There's no point in dying here over Crete. So that's an interesting one as well. So you've got these, an unofficial, informal truce that is established between the remaining Germans that are still there and the Allied force. And the German forces at that point are, of course, relatively low because why would you keep them on Crete when you need them somewhere else? I think that's enough. The whole thing about the civilian aspects, the occupation, the atrocities, I mean, that really is an interesting one. It's part, of course, of a much bigger debate about occupation, about atrocities, about partisans, about the laws of war, all these things. So I think we probably ought to do, a number of episodes on this, but it's a very, very difficult subject. And you need to be really careful when you touch this. So that's why I say we need to do quite a few episodes. The moment we touch this, we need to make sure that we get that right. So we just scratched the surface here because I think we wanted to mention that these things had some instinct, a nasty and a difficult subject too.
No question. And for those who were there in May 1941, all the fighting in Crete was probably nasty and difficult. I think that's probably a fair assessment. So, listeners and viewers out there, we've come to the end of our extra large second episode on the Crete campaign battle operation. What I think we can safely take away from it at this stage is, we have an idea of the different forces. It's that key airfield at Maleme. If there's one thing, why did the Germans win at Crete? You can now answer. If anybody's asking you at a party or at a bar, like, hey, there's a big debate, you can come in and say, hey, I know that. Or you're at your local pub and they're having a trivia quiz. And this is a question. The Germans carry the day at Crete because on the ground, they're able to keep that airfield. It's crucial. And that's what carries the day in the end for the Germans, although they never use paratroopers to that extent again because of the heavy losses that they suffered. So that's a reminder after all our blah, blah, blahing for an hour. That's the key takeaway I think you wanna have at a minimum for impressing your friends or enemies. So I think the whole debate about Freyberg, General Freyberg, the New Zealand commander, we will save for the war room, which is not accessible to the public, but it's accessible to members of our supporter community. And if you want to do that, If you want to support our podcast and make it possible for us to do stuff like this and give you more nuggets of knowledge to share with your family at the dinner table, whether they want it or not, you can support us by going to our website, bothsidesofthewire.com, becoming a member. That's how you get access to the war room and figure out what we think about poor old General Freiberg and was he at fault or not, and so on. If you want to trial all that for free for a month, just enter the code Deep Dark Woods, and then you get a free month trial of our supporter community. So thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.